This coronavirus has completely and utterly shifted everything, our entire lives. Who would ever have imagined? It's so interesting, in our shul, which we're lucky to have open still, so people come in and they press the code to get in because we're worried about the security risk of mass shootings and hate crimes. And now the question is, what's a greater worry? Because maybe the corona is a greater worry than chas v'shalom, a mass shooting. People's lives have been completely transformed, and that means that hopes have been dashed. Many people were dreaming of different things happening, just simple dreaming of a Pesach, perhaps a Pesach away with family. Many people have parnasa, have their livelihood dependent on Pesach, dependent on all sorts of jobs that they're not now unable to do. And how many brides and grooms are getting married, and a bride who dreamt her whole life about this beautiful, stunning wedding is now stuck and hopes are dashed. And the question really is, some of it is right, some of it's unfounded, but the fact is, as we find ourselves helpless, like you're at home with the kids, or you're lonely, all alone by yourself, quarantined, worried, and we're switching mode completely. We switch mode from these vibrant, lively people doing so many things, and now we're all just stuck and helpless. Now, what I want to just talk about is how do you handle when you're feeling helpless? How do you shift mode and actually be happy despite our inability and our helplessness in the situation we find ourselves in? So, we look always to the Torah because the Torah has instruction how to live our life, what we can do. So in the Torah, there's a story about Yosef HaTzadik. Yosef is an inspiration. Now, if you look at Yosef's story, he was a man who was capable of running the entire world, of being prime minister and saving the entire world. Egypt was the strongest country in the world, saving everybody from hunger. How do we know that? Because he did actually accomplish that. This same Yosef was such a tzaddik, such a holy man, that throughout the ages, we use his name, and the Jewish people are known in Tehillim. King David says, Noye Katzoin Yosef, we are known and named after Yosef. So this individual is one of the most incredibly talented people who ever lived. And yet, let's just snapshot this moment in Yosef's life when he gets thrown into a dungeon, and he gets put into a dungeon and he's there for 12 years. And mind you, Yosef had no idea how long this sentence was to last. This was Egypt, and there was no limit on how long he might be there. And yet you find that here's a guy who's got dashed hopes, has no way of ever knowing where he's going to go. Yet you find that Yosef remains happy the whole entire time. What did Yosef do? He's like, okay, I'm in a dungeon, I'm stuck. So what should I do? So he became the chief of the dungeon. Whatever his situation he finds himself in, he's like, okay, what can I do? I'm going to become the head of the dungeon. And he was always happy when the two ministers of the Pharaoh, Sarah Mashkim and Sarah Oifim, the butler and the baker, who themselves were in these high positions and now are thrown into a dungeon, the same dungeon Yosef was in, well, they are depressed. And Yosef looks at them and he comes and he says, Madua Pneichem Romayim, why are you guys down today? He himself was always happy. How do you do that? How do you stay always happy when you're so talented and your hopes are so dashed because you're stuck and absolutely messed up and doing nothing? Great, so you'll become the head of the dungeon. How does he do that? And the answer is that Yosef was a believer. He believed in God 100%. And he knew that God cared for him every step of the way. He believed in Hashgacha Pratis, in divine providence. That meant that his footsteps were guided and determined by God every single step of the way. So he looks around him and he sees, okay, what does God want of me today? So when he was a free man, he's like, well, I can do so much. And he did. Before he was in the dungeon and after he was in the dungeon, he behaved like a free man. But in those years, in those 12 years in the dungeon, Yosef looked around himself and he sees himself as helpless. And so he says, okay, so what does God want of me now? He doesn't want me to do all the things I'm capable of doing because I'm stuck. So what does God want of me? And Yosef looks around and he's like, okay, I'm helpless. Maybe God wants me to rely on him and to turn to him. Now there's an idea that's brought down in the Chovos HaLevavos. The Chovos HaLevavos is a book of which describes, one of the things he describes is how to have bitachon, how to trust in God. And there he explains that trust in God means to see yourself as someone who's in a dungeon and nobody has any power over you. Nobody can save you, nobody can help you, only God. It's about complete and utter trust in God. Now Yosef says, hey, when I'm free, it's very difficult to experience that because I always feel like it's something I can do. But when I'm in the dungeon and I'm really helpless, so what God wants of me is to meditate on this reflection, this very idea, this very notion of how dependent I am on God. And so that's exactly what he does. He focuses on that meditation. And now, instead of being helpless, he's actually pretty useful. What he's doing is working on his bitachon. He was working on his trust in God. And that's the idea that sometimes there's things we can do, and at those times God wants us to do stuff. And that's most of the time. And then once in a while this coronavirus comes up. And there's the avoida of corona. There's what God wants us to do when we face corona. And what does he want us to do? He's like, okay guys, I want you to look at your dashed hopes, at those Pesach plans you had, at those weddings you wanted to make, at those simchas you wanted to celebrate, everything but everything. And I want you to realize that God is in control. And I want you to focus on this Chovos HaLevavos, on this ability to see yourself as completely and utterly reliant on God. As like, I'm in a dungeon and nobody can help me but God. And Corona has got us on some level, in some measure, to this point. So instead of seeing ourselves as helpless, lesson number one, meditation number one from Corona is to see ourselves like Yosef as champions. And I'm stuck, I'm quarantined. I mean, not me right now, not yet. But if you're quarantined and if you're stuck and if you're unable to do so much, just look and say, God, you run the world. And I'm going to reflect on this very idea that God runs the world. It is an incredible opportunity for all of us to work in our bitachon, to work in our trust in God and to experience it. Because when you trust in God, there's a happiness, there's a tranquility that we experience. And the avoida, the work of Corona, is to be able to realize that tranquility so that we can live our lives from that tranquility. And that's called using Corona, using the powers of Corona for good. So as you're sitting down there, stuck, that's great meditation to begin with.